Yeah, the reason I wanted to talk about maths and faith is because I think they share a lot of similarities. Out of all of the science subjects, maths is the subject with the most theists, most people who believe in God. And there's a reason for that. It's because both maths and religion claim to have these kind of absolute truths about the world. And I think it was at the same time I started to discover some of the grey areas and some of the kind of more complicated paradoxes in maths that I also started to discover some of the kind of grey areas and more complicated areas of my faith. And I've always found that maths has been quite a helpful analogy to me to understand what I think about God and understand what I think about faith as well. And so hopefully in the course of this talk, you'll be able to find stories and things which kind of relate to you as well, and that you can kind of relate to your understanding of faith. And we're going to begin where Charlie began last week, with the Pythagoreans. In the 5th century BC, a man named Hippasus of Metapontum was sentenced to death by drowning by his fellow Pythagoreans. Does anybody know why?
Didn't do homework. That's a really good answer.
Well, interestingly, it was for discovering a new mathematical thing that was so devastating that it could fundamentally change the way that the Pythagoreans looked at the world. In fact, some accounts of his death say that it was the gods themselves who cast judgment on Hippasus and caused him to drown for impiety. But before I tell you what that mathematical discovery is, it's important to understand the environment of Greek mathematics that Hippasus existed in. So the Greeks had this view of maths that was very much in line with nature. They believed that all numbers could be described as ratios or fractions, and that these ratios defined perfect relationships that existed in the real world. Pythagoras is credited with defining intervals in music. And you can kind of see where this idea of ratios kind of being harmonious and perfect comes from, and maths describing the universe at whole. Here's an instrument called a monochord, which is used by Pythagoreans, which you can emulate here. If you play the string openly, you get the foundation. If you play it at a ratio of 2:1, you get an octave. Sounds nice. If you play it at a ratio of a third, you get a fifth. Also sounds nice. Quarter, fifth, or major third in that case. Another fifth. And so the ratios that were elegant in maths were also quite elegant in music as well. There was a pleasing kind of symmetry there. And like Charlie said last week, they extended this to the music of the spheres as well. Because the stars and the planets were fast-moving bodies in the sky, Pythagoras concluded that they also made noise, they also made sound, and that they orbited in nice ratios to each other, which produced this kind of harmony, just like the harmonies you get in music. And they called this the music of the spheres. And this is also something which you can observe as well. This is the TOI 178 system, and the planets in this orbit in a 2:4 to 6 to 9 to 12 ratio. And this is one person's interpretation of what that sounds like.
In this case, let's give each planet its own sound and then play that sound every time the planet sweeps through this line.
Perhaps not the Greeks were not what the Greeks were envisioning, but you can certainly see that there's an order there and there's a pattern there. And so this was the world in which the Greeks existed. They believed that numbers reflected and explained the true nature of the universe, and ratios were an important part of that. So we all know Pythagoras' theorem from school. So you square the two shorter sides, add them together, and you get the square of the longer side. So Hippasus was considering this problem with the simplest possible triangle you can do this on. Side length 1 and 1, and then you work out that the last side is the square root of 2. And he was wondering, what elegant ratio does this simple triangle represent? Could it be 7/5? Well, it didn't quite fit. What about 90 over 77, that's a closer guess. Well, again, it wasn't quite there. There was still a bit left over. 707 over 500? Well, it still didn't fit. And the more Hippasus tried, the more he realised that actually root 2 didn't equate to any ratio. It was a new type of number. It was an irrational number, a number that can't be described as a fraction, a number whose expansion goes on infinitely and randomly with no meaning and no beauty, something that must have been horrific to the Pythagoreans. And actually, it was this discovery of irrational numbers that ended up being the kind of sweater thread that thousands of years later would be pulled and pulled and pulled and would start to unravel the foundations of mathematics. Chapter 2, After Antiquity. So, fast forward to the 19th century. And actually, reality is a little bit more complicated than the Greeks had first anticipated. For a start, in music, we don't use Pythagorean tuning. It turns out when you have multiple strings on a guitar, you kind of need something a little bit more fudgy to make it sound nice. It's not as perfect as you think. And also with planets. Some systems sound very harmonic and resonant, but other systems, like our own solar system, not so much. The universe wasn't quite as the Greeks pictured it. But the one thing the Greeks were still a final authority on was geometry. So much so that there were problems that they left unsolved, which still hadn't been solved over 2,000 years later. So the Greeks did geometry with a ruler and compass, and they could do lots of things. You could bisect the angle, you could construct shapes of up to 17 sides and more, and it was very, very powerful tools, but there are a lot of seemingly simple things that they still were unable to do. Trisecting the angle, cutting an angle exactly into thirds, something they never worked out how to do. Squaring the circle.
Why is that so difficult?
Well, that's kind of what's so mind-boggling about it, is it looks ridiculously easy with a ruler and compass to do it nice and neatly, but actually it's not easy, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Squaring the circle, so making a square with exactly the same area as a circle. Also unsolved by the 19th century. And doubling the cube, this was another problem. And this one's actually got a story. This is called the Delian Problem. Around the same time as Hippasus, the inhabitants of the island of Delos had a problem. They were being struck by a huge, appalling plague that they believed had been brought upon them by Apollo. And so they went to the oracle at Delphi to ask what they could do about it. And she said, you need to double the size of your altar. Their altar was this perfect cube. So what they did was they took each side of the altar, they doubled the length to get an altar that was twice as big, and the plague got worse. And that was because what they'd actually done is made an altar that was 8 times as big as the one they'd originally made. And you may think this is a bit kind of pernickety of the gods to, call this a problem. But the Delians went to Plato to ask him about this problem, and he said, no, what you need to make is an altar with side length cube root 2 to have an altar that's twice as big. And he said, the gods didn't give you this problem because they wanted a bigger altar. They gave you this problem because they wanted you to contemplate a difficult geometry problem. They wanted you to solve this difficult problem for them. And actually another account of this story says that the Delians didn't have a plague. They had a difficult political dispute between them, and that they were given this difficult problem so that they'd put their efforts into geometry and stop squabbling between themselves. But yeah, all 3 of these problems remained unsolved until the 19th century, when eventually they were proved impossible. And this was a new thing in mathematics. This was something that would start to change, I guess, where the Greeks stood on geometry. People started to question the foundations of geometry a little bit more. So the authoritative book on geometry was written by Euclid, and it's called Euclid's Elements. And it uses this method called the axiomatic method. And it makes sense. You start with some axioms which are so simple and so self-evidently true that they don't need to be questioned. And then you derive lots of theorems from those axioms that inherit that truthful property. Because they've come from things that are true, they themselves are true, and so on and so forth. So everything you build up from those axioms, you know is true and you can be sure is true as long as the axioms are true. And Euclid's Elements had 5 axioms. And I'll say what they are in simple words, because they're meant to be self-evidently true because they're so simple. You can draw a straight line between any 2 points. We can agree on that. That straight line can be extended as long as you want. We can agree on that. You can draw a circle which is, any radius or at any point. We can agree on that. And all right angles are the same. But the 5th one always caused mathematicians trouble. If 2 lines are drawn which intersect a third in such a way that the sum of their inner angles on one side is less than 2 right angles, then the 2 lines inevitably must intersect each other on that side if extended far enough. Do we think that's self-evidently true? Well, the Greeks weren't sure. You can put it in a simpler way, which they later did, which is for a given point and line, you can draw exactly one parallel line through that point, which is a bit simpler, but it's still not quite so obviously true that you don't have to question it at all. And this was a problem. So what mathematicians tried to do was they tried to prove this 5th axiom as a theorem of the other ones. Because if it came from the other axioms, it would inherit the truthfulness of those axioms and we'd know it was true without having to question it. And in trying to do this, what they discovered was it was impossible. You can't prove that the 5th axiom is true from the other axioms. It's something you either have to accept as fact or reject as fact. And you can't really reject it and still get all the results that Euclid did in his book Elements.
So why did Euclid come up with the 5th one?
Well, the interesting thing about the 5th one is that it is something that we observe in reality. It is something that's true. If you have a plane surface, like a floor, and you've got a level, there's only level in one position. You can only have one parallel line to another parallel line. We kind of know that to be true, but it's one of those things which it's not as obviously true as all right angles are the same. We can't prove it to be true in a really concrete way. And the reason specifically that the Greeks didn't like this one is because they'd come across, their definition of parallel lines was there are lines that do not touch even at infinity. But the Greeks had come across lines in nature that do touch, but only at infinity, called asymptotic lines. And so they went, how do we know that these lines don't touch even at infinity? So it was a problem for them. And it's not as simple as the other ones. So what mathematicians then did was they said, well, what if we decide that we just make up a different axiom for this one? What if we say that actually you can have as many parallel lines as you want parallel to the line, which isn't generally true in reality? Or what if we say there's no parallel lines that go parallel to a given line? And in doing this, they're able to create a new version of geometry for worlds that can only really exist in your mind's eye. And we've got things like hyperbolic geometry, which kind of relates to a type of space that really you can't represent in our world. It can only exist in your mind. Or spherical geometry, which we can understand. And this started to change the meaning of truth within mathematics. Mathematics was no longer about what was true in nature. It was no longer about reflecting what was true in nature. It was about what was true of the axioms, what was true based on the axioms that you give. The axioms themselves don't have to relate to the real world. They don't have to be meaningful statements. But the theorems that you derive from those axioms are true based on those axioms. It's a bit confusing, but
just generalising the idea of the Cartesian space, which what Euclid was implicitly using.
Well,
all his stuff basically using relied on our notion of real numbers.
Did it?
Yeah. This idea of lines are basically just a physical representation of the real numbers system.
I'm not sure he would have thought of it like that, though,
No,
because he wasn't aware of real
like
numbers.
We think like that now.
Yeah, it's true. We do think like that now. But I think what I'm getting at here is this questioning of Euclidean space and then moving into non-Euclidean geometries was what then started us thinking about axioms and the truths that come from axioms rather than what was true of the universe we live in. Because something like hyperbolic space, to an extent, is not really observable. And so other truths in mathematics are true only of themselves and not really true of the universe we live in. And this is what led Bertrand Russell to say, mathematics may be defined as a subject in which we never know what we're talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true. It's just about deriving true statements from axioms which we don't know whether they relate to the world or not.
And is it just a matter of, like, how did Euclid come up with those 5 ones specifically? Because it feels like there'd be so many others. Like, why are those 5 his famous ones?
So they're his famous ones because that's what you can do with a straight edge and a compass.
Okay.
And so that's, but in a sense, you kind of want the smallest amount of axioms that you can reasonably work with. So you're not trying to encompass all truths, you're trying to encompass a small set of truths from which other truths can then be derived. But anyway, it's all got quite abstract now, so we're going to take a little break to consider the Munduruku tribe. So this is an Amazonian tribe from Brazil who have a very different concept of counting. And they come from a group of tribes, actually, which have a very different concept of counting to what we do. They have 5 numbers. Those numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, and many. And even the numbers that we recognise, they don't really use in the same sense that we use them. They're quite vague about them. So if you ask a Munduruku tribesman, how many children do you have? He'll probably just say, I don't know. Or, how many fish do we need to feed everyone for dinner? He'll say, I don't know. Which raises a problem. If you are a Munduruku tribesman and you've got many chickens, and your neighbour also has many chickens, and you want to know who has more chickens, how do you do that without counting? It's not a rhetorical question.
Visually?
Well, just a mapping, just a numerative mapping. Map one chicken off with the other guy's chicken and see who's got any left over.
Exactly.
Definition is who's got more.
So this is exactly the way you do it. You would take one chicken, your neighbour would put up one chicken. You'd take one chicken, your neighbour would put up one chicken, assuming they all stay in the same place. And at the end,
Just called enumeration, but even little children can do that.
well, exactly. It's a very intuitive way of counting, which doesn't require numbers. It's a way of counting when your numbers run out. And so, to reiterate, if you end up with chickens left over, you know that you have more chickens. Or, if you end up with the same amount of chickens, you know that...
This is what they actually do.
I don't know if they do it specifically, but you'd imagine they probably employ something like this. And actually, we have a similar problem in our counting system, which is that at some point the numbers do run out. We reach infinity, or we have this concept of infinity where we can't really do anything with it. It's beyond numbers. And there was a man named George Cantor who used a similar kind of method to give us a new and more wider understanding of infinity. And this was a groundbreaking change, kind of at the start of the 20th century. It was very controversial. Cantor's tutor, Leopold Kronecker, said of him, "I don't know what predominates in Cantor's theory, philosophy or theology, but I'm sure that there is no mathematics there." So, yeah, let's dive into it. We're going to do a little thought experiment. Imagine that there is a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And one day you arrive at the hotel and you're looking for a room and the clerk says, "Well, I'm sorry, sir, but all of the rooms are full." Well, there's a way that you can still stay at the hotel. Just tell the clerk, well, tell everybody in their rooms to move to the next room up. So if you're in room number 1, you move to room number 2. If you're in room number 3, you move to room number 4. And then I'll just get in the first room. And so here what we've shown is that infinity and 1 people can fit in an infinite hotel. Unlike the chickens, where you've got the same amount of chickens mapping to the same amount of chickens, what we've shown is that because infinity and 1 people can fit in infinity rooms, they must be the same number. Okay, so you tell all of your friends about this great hotel. And you're a very popular guy. You've got an infinite number of friends. And the hotel clerk says again, "Well, I'm sorry, sir, it's a popular hotel. We're all full." What do? Well, you say to the hotel clerk, "Well, that's fine. Tell everybody in their room to go to the room that's double their room number. And then me and my friends will just get in the odd-numbered rooms." And what we've shown here is that you can fit 2 times infinity people in an infinite number of rooms. And so 2 times infinity is the same number as infinity because you can map one to the other just like you can map chickens to chickens. And you can do this with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as many as you like, and it's still just infinity. So let's raise a stake. All of your friends tell all of their friends, and an infinite number of buses containing an infinite number of people arrive at the hotel. And today the hotel's empty, which is handy. How do you fit all of these people in the hotel? Well, this is what the hotel clerk does. First, she makes this table where she has all of the bus numbers on the top row and all of the passenger numbers along the side. So this person here is passenger number 1, bus number 1. And this person number here is passenger number 2 in bus number 3, and so on and so forth. And then this is how she allocates the room. She goes, okay, passenger number 1 of bus number 1 can go in room 1. Passenger number 2 of number 1 of bus number 2 can go in room 2. And you just kind of follow this line and keep on going and keep on going. And eventually you'll cover everybody in every bus and the hotel will be full. And so here we've shown that even an infinite number of infinite people can fit in an infinite hotel. So the same number, infinity times infinity, is the same as infinity. Nothing too groundbreaking yet. But then one day, a big rabble of people is outside the hotel. And it's different to the other times. This time, they're all wearing shirts with different irrational numbers on them. Do you remember these from Hippasus? There's root 2 there. And these are all basically just decimal numbers, numbers with lots and lots of numbers after the decimal point. The clerk's saying, I don't really know what to do here. And she just decides to put them into the rooms as best she can and makes this little chart to show which person's in which room. Now, there's a way of showing here that no matter how the clerk arranges the guests to the rooms, there will always be at least one guest left over who hasn't got a room. And I'll show you how you do that. First, for the sake of argument, assume that the clerk has found a way to fit everybody in every room. Now, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take the first number of the first guest and we're going to write it down at the bottom. And then the second number of the second guest, third number of the third guest, fourth number of the fourth guest, etc., etc., etc. And we get this new decimal number down at the bottom. Step 2. We're now going to change every number of this decimal number by 1. It doesn't really matter how you do it. You can go up 1, down 1, as long as it's a different number to the number at the top here. And what we've created here is a new decimal number. And because it's a decimal number, and there's an infinite number of decimals, this person ought to have a room in the hotel. So what room is guest number 3.13339, etc., etc., staying in? Well, are they staying in room number 1? Well, they can't be staying in room number 1 because it's a different number. And we know it's definitely a different number because the first digit is definitely different from the first digit there. Are they staying in room number 2? Well, no, because the second digit is different from the second digit there. Are they staying in room number 3? No, because the third digit is different from the third digit there, and etc., etc. No matter what room you try, you'll find that actually this person isn't staying at the hotel because their nth digit is different from the nth digit of the nth guest. And so we've created a new person who doesn't have a room. And no matter how many times you add an extra person and try and fit the guests in the rooms differently, there will always be a way of making another person who can't fit in the hotel. And essentially what we've shown here is there are chickens left over. And what does that mean? That means that there are more irrational numbers than there are regular numbers. There's a bigger infinity. And this is a groundbreaking discovery, that some infinities are bigger than other infinities. And it was troubling to the mathematical world. Cantor, I think, recognised the
For the mathematicians weeping into their coffee.
I just wondering when you were starting to get anxious yet.
Well, you're kind of not far off. It caused a big ruckus in the mathematical world. Cantor had intended to go to Göttingen, which is the kind of mecca of maths at that time. That's where all of the best ideas in maths were coming. And because of his ideas and how controversial they were, he was prevented every step along the way. This is a comment that came from Mittag Leffler, a Swedish mathematician and the editor of Acta Mathematica, when he received a paper of Gödel's. He said, "I'm convinced that the publication of your new work, before you've been able to explain new positive results, greatly damage your reputation among mathematicians. It may well be that you and your theory will never be given the justice you deserve in our lifetime. And that's exactly what happened. Gödel ended up moving to the small town of Halle, and after his wife and his son died, he basically went insane, and he was routinely committed to the mental institute there throughout the course of his lifetime. He never achieved the high up positions in the good universities that he hoped to achieve.
This is Cantor.
Cantor, sorry, did I say Gödel?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Cantor, yeah, Cantor.
And why? Because it just upset the apple cart.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I guess I'll get onto this a bit in the future, well, in the next few slides, but you can either see maths as something which comes from nature, which I think is called mathematical realism, or something which is made up. And with something as abstract as infinity, it's kind of, it upset people enough where they go, oh, we don't have to accept this. We don't have to think that this is a real thing. This could just be something that doesn't exist. And also, actually, Cantor was famous not just for infinity, but something called set theory, which kind of enabled him to create these new versions of infinity. And set theory had some inherent paradoxes in it, which were quite hard to palate for people. When there's paradoxes in maths, it can sometimes mean that the system's inconsistent. And perhaps actually I can quickly describe one now. A set is basically a way of saying this is a collection of objects, usually numbers. So you could have the set of all integers. So that's a collection of every single whole number. But you could also have the set of all even numbers, for instance, which is all of the even numbers, just a collection of all of them. But then it kind of gets more abstract than that. You can also have the set of all sets. So a set that contains every set of everything. And this is where it's helpful to start thinking of the analogy of a library. So imagine you have a library and you've got a kind of, what do they call the book? The librarian's book, which has all the list of the different books. The catalogue. You've got a library catalogue. And the set of all sets is a bit like the library catalogue, which has the list of all the titles of the different books in the library catalogue. Okay, let's take it a step further. You can have a library catalogue of all sets that contain themselves, which is the same thing as saying a library catalogue of all books that contain their own title. Does anyone know of a book that contains its own title? Moby Dick, Pride and Prejudice, something like that? Let's say Moby Dick contains its own title and Pride and Prejudice doesn't. If Moby Dick contains the words Moby Dick, it will be in this catalogue of books that contain their own title. Pride and Prejudice wouldn't be if it doesn't contain the words Pride and Prejudice. That's all right. That's something which is okay to palate. What about when you have a book which contains a list of all the books that don't contain their own titles? This is where it starts to get complicated, because does that book contain its own name? Because if the catalogue contains its own name, then it's a book which contains its own name, so it shouldn't contain its own name. Whereas if that catalogue doesn't contain its own name, then it's a book that doesn't contain its own name and should contain its own name.
Is it a bit like all people in Crete are liars, the Cretan says?
It's exactly like that. It's a self-referential paradox, which is inherent in set theory and makes it problematic. You can kind of go, well, is this something I choose to accept, or is this something which actually might not work? I mean, you can make up any mathematical concept you like. You can say 2 + 2 = 5, but you don't have to accept it as a mathematical concept. And this caused a ruckus among mathematicians and really kind of split them down battle lines. On the one side, you had the intuitionists, and these were people who rejected Cantor's ideas of infinity. And furthermore, they believed that maths was merely an extension of human intuition, and that it only really existed in your minds. It wasn't a feature of nature. It didn't exist outside of the human mind. And they wholeheartedly rejected Cantor's ideas. Henri Poincaré said, later generations will regard set theory as a disease from which one has recovered. And Cantor's own tutor said that he was a scientific charlatan and a corrupter of the youth. Which is pretty strong words. On the other side, though, you had the formalists who embraced Cantor's ideas. They saw Cantor's ideas as a way of creating a stable foundation for mathematics. Set theory gave mathematicians a language with which to formalize mathematics and make it structurally sound. And David Hilbert, who was kind of informal leader of the formula said, no one shall expel us from the paradise that Cantor has created. And they had this huge goal, and that was they wanted to prove once and for all that mathematics lay on stable foundations that were consistent, that couldn't be shaken. And if you could prove that of mathematics, then you could prove that of physics. And if you could prove that of physics, you could prove it of chemistry and biology. And I think really it was an ideal to prove that the world lay on stable foundations that we could understand. And this is what they set about doing. So two mathematicians called Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead did something similar to what Euclid did. They picked some axioms, 6 axioms, which were so obvious, so beyond any doubt that you could derive everything from them and be sure that, you know, the foundations they lay on were solid. And they created this incredibly long series of books. There's 3 books here, 2,000 pages, which proved the most basic things you can imagine in mathematics. The text looked a bit like this, you know, completely indecipherable. It's not even relating to numbers. It's just pure logic and strange satanic-looking symbols. This is a proof which is on page 746 that 1 + 1 = 2, under which the authors dryly note, this proposition is occasionally useful. So that's the levels of basicness they were trying to get to here. And what were they trying to prove? Well, Hilbert laid out 3 goals in a fiery speech he gave at a conference in the 1930s. They wanted to show mathematics was complete. What does that mean? It means from those 6 axioms, the 6 self-evident truths, they could encompass every true thing within mathematics. If there was a true statement about maths, it could be derived from those 6 axioms. The second one's probably the most important one, which is mathematics consistent? And this means you can't prove 2 contradictory things from the same axioms. Because if you can say the sky is blue and the sky is not blue, the whole system falls apart. You can't trust any of the system because that one bit is wrong. And the last one is mathematics decidable? If it's not, that means there are some questions which may be true or may be false, but we can never know the answer to. So that's quite important as well. And at the end of this fiery speech he gave in 1930, he said these words: in opposition to the foolish ignorabimus, our slogan shall be, we must know, we will know. These words are so important that they're actually on David Hilbert's grave. Little did he know that a young mathematician called Kurt Gödel, at the age of 24, already had the answers to one of these questions. And he'd actually shared it at the same conference the day before. That brings us to our final chapter, Gödel's Theorem. So, yeah, I mean,
Those glasses.
I think this was him at age 20. I'm not going to say too much about Kurt Gödel. I think he was a mathematician. He studied at the University of Vienna, originally physics, and then moved into kind of more formal maths. His own view of maths was that he was a mathematical realist. He believed that maths existed in nature, outside, independently of the human mind. And so his own findings ended up being quite troubling to him. I kind of want to lay out how Gödel's incompleteness theorem works. What he did was he managed to find a self-referential paradox at the very heart of mathematics, at the very heart of the system. You were talking about the all creation's alive paradox at the start, and this is exactly the same thing. The reason this is a paradox is because it's able to say something about itself.
Yeah.
It's able to refer to itself, and usually when we're talking, we're talking about a table or a lamp or the ceiling. We're talking about other things. We're not talking about our own words. And that's where the problem lies. So to get around this, to try and avoid these kind of self-referential paradoxes like the catalogue one, like other ones like that, what Russell and Whitehead did in their book was to strictly define what statements could be about. So they said that any statement in their book that's mathematics must be about numbers. It can't be about other statements, because we don't want this to happen. Whereas there can be another type of statement called meta-mathematics, and that can be about statements. But it can't be about itself. Otherwise, that would be meta-mathematics. And They divided everything into strict lanes so that you could never have a self-referential paradox because every statement referred only to numbers and numbers were just numbers. Gödel's ingenious move was to find a way of making numbers describe statements again. And this is what Gödel based his idea on. His one's a bit complicated, but this hopefully is a bit more simple. Imagine you've got a book like Principia Mathematica which describes properties of numbers. And maybe it'll be something like a number that is square, like a square number, a prime number, a number that is even. Because these statements are all written in English, we can put them in order. We put them in order of length. And if there are two statements that are the same length, we can order them in terms of being alphabetical. And now that they have a well-defined order, we can number them. So now we've encountered the danger zone because statements are about numbers, but also we've got numbers describing statements here. A number is labeling a statement. And so sometimes a statement can say something about itself. Well, this one doesn't. A number that's even, it's about 1. That's obviously not even. Or this one, a number that's square, and it's about 3. That's not a square number. But a number that's prime, well, 2 is a prime number. And so here we've got a statement which says something about itself. This is how Gödel creates the paradox. He said, okay, let's look at these statements, the statements which say something false about themselves, and let's give them a name. Let's say that any statement which says any number which has a statement that's not true of itself, we'll call Richardian. And now, being Richardian is a property of numbers, and so we can add it to our list of properties of numbers. And now a familiar paradox crops up. Is n, the number that relates to this statement, Richardian? That is, if it is Richardian, that is, the statement isn't true of the number, then it is Richardian. But if it is Richardian, this statement can't be true of the number, so it's not Richardian. And you've got the same self-referential paradox. And Gödel did the same thing. He managed to make numbers prove a statement which said, this statement isn't provable under Principia Mathematica. And we're quite deep in the paint now with the logic. But if this statement, we want to show that Principia Mathematica was complete. That is, every true statement is provable under Principia Mathematica. If you have a statement which says it isn't provable under Principia Mathematica, and it isn't included in Principia Mathematica, then it's true. And so you want to include every true statement, so it must be included in Principia Mathematica, which means that it's not true because it says it's not true. And so, again, this paradox of self-reference creeps back into logic. And this is the kind of the bad apple in the bunch, the thing that poisons the whole basket. And so here we've got a problem. If our foundation for mathematics encompasses these statements, then it can't be consistent because we've got two contradictory statements. And so the only thing we can say is it mustn't include these statements so that it can be consistent. And therefore we know mathematics can never be complete. And this was the first fundamental finding of Gödel, is that maths is something which can never encompass all of the truths about mathematics. We can never have a foundation which is able to prove everything, which has profound implications outside of mathematics. Say again?
You can never have a single one.
Well, yeah, you can never have a single one. And whenever you...
Multiple ones.
Well, I don't know if you can. We can probably argue that later, because...
What he defined is that you can never have a single one that explains everything.
But if you add...
Yeah, and then you get a meta layer and a meta layer and a meta layer,
But if you had to have two systems... No, I'll talk to you about this afterwards. What he showed is if you were to extend the system so that you were to include the true statement that it's missing, you could create another true statement that it was missing again. And so mathematics could never encompass all of the truths of mathematics. You'd always need an extra axiom added onto your list to try and include it, and it would just go on forever. But even though our system of mathematics isn't complete, can it still be consistent? Can we still be sure that it's a stable foundation that can describe, without contradiction, the things that it already does describe? And devastatingly, the answer is, we can't know. What Gödel showed is that actually the basis we have for mathematics could be consistent, or it might not be. but it's never able to prove itself consistent. We're never able to know from mathematics that it's consistent. And so mathematics always runs this risk of discovering a new theorem, something like irrational numbers, which upsets the apple cart and shows that actually the whole thing had a flaw in it from the start. And we can never defend ourselves from that using the system. And so, in a sense, there's an element of faith inherent in mathematical systems, where you say, okay, we just have to trust that the statements, the axioms are true, even though we can't prove the axioms are true. And this is where it seems to kind of relate to faith as well. It's something where we just have to trust that, you know, the things we know about God are true and the things we know about life are true, but we can never prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt to ourselves. We can never prove our own consistency in terms of faith. The last one is decidability. And this is a really interesting concept. It's slightly different from the first one. Decidability refers to whether there are things that we can never know. There's things that are just fundamentally unprovable in mathematics. And it turns out that actually, you know, there are undecidable things in mathematics. There are things that mathematics can never explain. Do you remember we said there were, you know, at least two different types of infinity earlier on? Well, you know, there's countable infinity, as we call it. There's uncountable infinity, and there's an infinite number of infinities larger than that as well. But the question of whether there's an infinity between those two infinities is an undecidable problem. It's called the continuum hypothesis. It's a question which could be true or could be false, but you can never prove it either way. And in fact, actually, mathematics makes sense if you choose either statement.
Josh, you're saying that Gödel proved that maths couldn't prove everything?
Yes. Well, that was Gödel and also a bit Alan Turing as well, I think.
Yeah, well, Church, Theorem and Gödel basically proved the same thing from different angles.
Yeah.
It's a halting problem, or
Yeah.
as far as Church and Gödel were concerned, they called it a halting problem, but essentially it is the same problem.
Exactly that. Mathematics has proved that some things are always beyond the reach of mathematics. And you'd think this only applies to things which are very abstract and, you know, infinities and philosophical things like that. But actually, it affects the real world as well. In the 1990s, some students from MIT tried to create an algorithm that could find the cheapest airfare for any given flight. And they worked on this for a really, really long time before they realized that that specific problem, with all of the complicated rules that airlines have for airfares, was actually undecidable. It was impossible to create an algorithm that could always find the cheapest airfare for any flight. That's not saying you can't find it for some flights, but that was undecidable. There's also something called the spectral gap problem, which is to do with quantum physics and the physical properties of materials. And there it says, even if you can see every individual electron, you know, on a microscopic level of some certain materials, you still can't predict what their macroscopic properties will be. And so it's something which affects the real world as well as the really abstract philosophical world. I wanted to end with a little excerpt from a book by Borges. So there's a temptation, I think, to try and accept a version of the world in which we do have a complete understanding, in which we convince ourselves that we have a consistent and complete understanding of the world, and it abides by rules. A bit like the Greeks, we kind of simplify things like music and the movements of the planets so that we can comprehend them. And it's very tempting to do that. There's a book by Louis Borges called Tlun, Ukbar and Orbis Tertius, and it's about a man who discovers these made-up encyclopedias that relate to a completely fictional world. And this is an example of a real encyclopedia about a fictional world, a really rare one. And they talk about cultures that don't exist on a planet that doesn't exist, with languages that don't exist. And when these encyclopedias get released into the real world, their complete understanding, their decipherability is so intoxicating to the real people that they start accepting these cultures and these languages and these practices over our own. They start embracing them.
Sounds like Klingon.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got university courses that now teach you Klingon.
Well, it's a complete language, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's crazy. And And this is what he says at the end. He says, talking about when the culture of the encyclopedias overtook their real culture of humanity, he says, almost immediately reality caved in at more than one point. The truth is, it wanted to cave in. 10 years ago, any symmetry, any system with an appearance of order, dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, could spellbind and hypnotise mankind. How could the world not fall under the sway of Slun? How could it not yield to the vast and minutely detailed evidence of an ordered planet? It would be futile to reply that reality is orderly. Perhaps it is, but orderly in accordance with divine laws, that we can never quite manage to penetrate. Slun may well be a labyrinth, but it is a labyrinth forged by men, and a labyrinth designed to be deciphered by men. I found it really interesting. I think there is always a temptation to accept a world which is designed to be deciphered by men, something which is a simplified version of the world. But the reality is we exist in a universe where there is an order that we can perceive, but one that we can never fully comprehend. I think it's these results within mathematics which really ground us in that understanding and help us to accept that there will always be things that we have to accept by faith and always things that we can never understand. And that's the end of my talk.
I can safely say that was the most interesting talk about maths that I've ever heard.